I want to talk in this video about a strategy we call the client flip model. And this is basically where you become your own client. And I'll talk through some examples of where we've done it ourselves and the reasons that led us to doing it each time. And I'll also share a few stories of other people that have done it, and in one case, why it went wrong for one of those people. So the first time we did this, it was probably around 2001, 2002, and it was in our mechanical and electrical contracting business. We had quite a few clients, but there were just some clients that we just couldn't get into. They wouldn't even let us tender for the contract. So these were construction companies, and it didn't matter what we did, we just couldn't crack them. So we questioned, how can we grow the business any further in this area if we can't get into the rest of these potential clients? Because we were pretty much working for every other construction business in that area. So we came up with this idea of becoming our own client. So what that meant was we positioned our business as a management contractor. So rather than trying to deliver one or two services, we became the company that would take on that main contract, and then we divide it up and have other firms working for us, and we manage it. We still had our regular business running, but this new model became another client for that business. Now, what that meant was we were now the client for these companies that we'd previously tried to work for. So they now wanted to work with us because we were potentially giving them contracts. So it cracked the door open in both cases. The second example we used this model on was the business had always been involved in various property developments. It goes right back to my great-granddad that we'd always been involved in developing various types of property. But the thing with developing property is you need someone to buy it when it's complete. And this is probably the riskiest part of the whole process because you don't get paid until you've sold it. So we asked the question, how could we become our own client for this? And so we created a new business, which was a holiday accommodation business, cottages and apartments that we would rent out to people who were on holiday. Now, what this meant was it gave us a customer for the properties that we were building. And we didn't need to worry about trying to sell them because we already had the buyer, which was ourselves right from the start of the project, which was obviously this new holiday lettings business. Next was one of our partners that we worked with. He was a small developer in Glasgow, and his model was he'd renovate old flats and then sell them on. But he realized he had the same potential problem that we'd had in our own example. And it was around the same time as that as well. Now, we were the management contractor for him. So it was in our interest to help him find a solution. So we suggested to use this client flip model and become his own client. Now, what that meant was he set up a lettings business. So when the properties were complete, he'd rent them out. And by remortgaging them through this new business, he could get his money back out of them without worrying about finding a buyer. The next example was a renewable energy company I was involved with. Now, this business was a contractor that installed biomass boilers. Now, biomass boilers were quite a new concept at the time. They'd been used in places like Scandinavia for decades, but they'd only been in the UK for maybe 15 years. And the other problem was they were really expensive compared to a standard gas or oil boiler. I think the cheapest biomass boiler was about £30,000 compared to a gas boiler, which was probably about 3,000. But it was also around the time of the 2009 recession. So it meant businesses just didn't have the money to spend on upgrading the heating system. So we flipped it. Instead of acting like a plumber that goes along and installs a new boiler, we became our own client. We created a business that would supply businesses with energy and then just charge them for the units that they use. So rather than them paying £500,000 for boiler equipment, they'd pay, say, 20 pence for every unit of heat that they used. So the contracting business would build these energy generation plants. The businesses would get paid. That business would get paid as normal from the new energy supply company that we set up. And then the energy supply company would bill the customer for the energy that they used on this kind of pay-as-you-go model. And now everyone is using this model, but we were the first to create it. The next example is a fairly large housing developer that I know. And this business started out as a construction contractor. And then over time, they slowly bought a piece of land and they started developing and selling their own houses. So they'd already done this client flipping process a long time ago, maybe 40 years ago. So when I met them, they were building probably about 200 houses a year. But then when the recession hit in 2009, they found they got various housing sites that were half complete. People weren't buying houses anymore because they couldn't get mortgages. So what they did was they did this client flipping model again. They became their own client. Rather than trying to sell these houses to home buyers for all the unsold lots, they set up a property rentals business so that people could rent the houses from them instead. And that meant the development company would get paid. They could finish the half completed sites and they didn't have to start laying people off. And the final example I want to share is about someone that tried to use this model, but it ended up going badly wrong. And it's because of how they actually set it up. And the rule of doing this is you have to set it up as a standalone business. If you try and do it as part of your existing business, you get all types of complications. You might even have potential tax issues as well. It's trying to merge different business models together, but each business model has its own motivations. So they end up working against each other. So in this example, it was an electrical contractor. And although it did the same type of work as us, it was never really a competitor because it was just one guy working for himself. So he never really competed against us on the type of projects that we worked on. Anyway, he had some kind of he had the same frustrations as we'd had earlier. He was trying to get into working for a couple of housing developers, but they just weren't entertaining. And he'd been trying to work for them for a few years at this point. So what he did was try and set up in competition with them. So he set up this housing development business, but then he ran it through his contracting business. He ran it like a construction company. Now, if you know how a developer model works versus a contractor model, the developer basically doesn't employ any staff. It's just a few people to oversee the contract. Whereas a contracting business model employs lots of staff, and so it has a big overhead and lots of costs. Now, what happened with this business, it was working as a contractor building these houses, but there was never any focus on those construction staff making a profit. There was no ceiling price for the projects. So there was never any rush to get things complete. The project would just drag on. Nobody was incentivized to reduce delivery costs. And so the projects ended up being like a bottomless pit. And by this point, I think he had about 50 staff working on these projects with nobody keeping an eye on how things were costing, how much things were costing. I think he just assumed that whatever the cost was, that was it. And he'd make money from it regardless of the cost. But part of what was actually driving him in this process was his ego. He was trying to show these other two developers that he'd been trying to work for, that he was better than them. And he actually publicly stated that he was going to put them out of business. So he ended up borrowing lots of money from his wife was the bank manager at one of the banks. So she was approving all of these loans, and he was going out buying up any piece of land they could find just to try and prove something to these other two companies. And he was paying whatever price the landowners wanted. It was all about having his name everywhere that you looked. So we had about 50 new vans all driving around within about 12 months. Again, this goes against that developer model because he obviously had to find the money to pay for these vans as well. Anyway, within a couple of years of setting that up, the whole thing went bankrupt, losing millions. And I think his wife ended up losing her job at the bank as well. And then, more importantly, within a couple of years, he set it up again, only this time setting it up the right way, getting rid of all those construction stuff and literally just having himself and two others working in the business. And more importantly, with a focus on limiting the cost of a project by employing external contractors that all work to that fixed price. Now, I know I focus quite heavily on the property or construction industry with these examples, but you can use this model with any business or industry. And there's other businesses that we've used it with in other industries. All that you need to do is question who is your client and what would you need to do so that you could set this new client business up. What pieces would you need to be able to do that? So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you've not seen my other videos, I'd recommend you watch the asset commercialization and the venture builder videos next.